So far, we've learned that carbohydrates are parts of food that are made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and that there are three basic kinds of carbohydrates: sugars, starch, and fiber. We've also learned that sugar and starch in natural foods are usually delivered with a healthy helping of fiber. In grocery stores, it's a very different picture. In many foods, large amounts of pure sugar have been added, and the cellular structure that carbohydrates are bound to in natural foods has been destroyed. The effect of such foods on our body's glucose management system is, well, not good. So, eating a healthy diet is less a matter of how many carbohydrates you consume, as it is a matter of what kind of carbohydrates. Recognizing that, people have categorized carbs in many ways. You're probably familiar with some of them: bad, simple, complex, refined, whole, high carb, low carb. Many of these terms have been adopted by the combatants in the carbohydrate wars and defined or redefined to suit their purposes, which is generally to persuade you to buy their product. As a result, these categories are not actually all that helpful. This course views carbs in terms of their effects on blood sugar and insulin. What if we could measure just that? How? Well, you could give everyone in a group of test subjects an identical amount of carb-containing food to eat, and then measure their blood sugar levels for a few hours afterwards. That's exactly what scientists have done. And based on such tests, they've generated numbers that indicate how many different kinds of food affect blood sugar. That number is called glycemic index, usually abbreviated as GI. The form of carbohydrate with the highest influence on blood sugar is glucose. The GI of glucose is set at 100, and foods are measured in comparison with that. This graph illustrates the blood sugar effects of a high GI food versus a low GI food. While the glycemic index is a great way to see that different forms of carbohydrate affect the body differently, there are problems with it in practice. For example, watermelon has a GI of 72, which is quite a high number. However, as part of a meal or a snack, its actual effect on blood sugar is quite low. What's missing is the fact that watermelon is mostly water, and you'd have to eat a huge amount of it to have a significant effect on blood sugar. Typical serving size matters, and it isn't taken into account in determination of glycemic index. To overcome this problem, another way of assigning a number was developed, which takes into account both the glycemic index and the typical serving size of different foods. That number is called glycemic load. You can use glycemic load to compare the effects of different kinds of food in the amounts that you would usually see on your plate. This chart shows glycemic index and glycemic load figures. You can see how different these are when you look first at the foods with the 10 highest glycemic index numbers and then the 10 highest glycemic load numbers. They hardly match at all. The glycemic load of a food is often classified as low, medium, or high. Glycemic load is much more useful information than what you'll find on food labels, but it's still a far cry from perfect. For one thing, not everyone has the same response to the same food. There's actually a rather wide range. Also, glycemic index and load numbers are only available for about 5 to 10% of all foods. Third, in testing, the person eats only the food being tested, but we almost always eat those foods along with other foods. And it turns out that foods in combination have a different effect on blood sugar than foods eaten separately. Fourth, it can be difficult to know that the food that was tested is the same one you want to find out about. There are many kinds of whole wheat bread, for example, and the way the bread is made can have a huge impact on its glycemic load numbers. Is it better for your blood sugar management to eat foods with lower glycemic index and load numbers? Generally, yes, as long as you also avoid foods with high fructose content, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson. And are all foods with a low glycemic load number healthy? Not at all. Some candy bars, for example, have a relatively low glycemic load. There are many other factors in addition to glycemic load that determine whether or not a food is actually good for you. If you can't rely on glycemic index and glycemic load to choose healthy foods, what can you do? Well, despite their flaws, measurements of glycemic index and glycemic load have revealed a vitally important truth about carbohydrate-containing foods, which is that their effect on blood sugar is hugely impacted by how the food is processed and prepared. This knowledge opens the door to a very practical and time-proven method for knowing what is best to eat, which we'll talk about in the remaining lessons of this course. Meantime, the bottom line is that according to modern nutritional science, perhaps the most important thing to know about food is that much of what we eat has had a long and eventful journey from the fields to our forks. And what has been done to the food on that journey determines in large part what happens when the food comes off the fork and into our bodies. This is of such importance that it is the entire focus of Lesson 5.